The speed, 870 kilometers per hour, faster than anything with wings. The problem, a 60% chance the engines would explode before you landed. The pilot, a man who had to decide every single morning whether today was the day he would die, not from enemy fire but from his own aircraft. This is the story of the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. But it's really about what happens when desperation pushes technology faster than wisdom can follow, and what it reveals about the terrible mathematics of war, where nations calculate whether killing their own pilots is an acceptable cost of killing the enemy first. April 1944. Lechfeld Airfield, Bavaria. Hauptmann Wolfgang Später stood beside an aircraft that looked like it had arrived from a different century. No propeller. Just two bulging nacelles slung beneath swept wings, housing engines that worked on principles most mechanics didn't understand. The Me-262 sat on the tarmac like a promise and a threat, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Spaht had flown Messerschmitts for 3 years. He had survived the Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front, the defense of the Reich against endless waves of American bombers. He was one of Germany's most experienced test pilots, which meant he was also one of the few pilots experienced enough to understand exactly how dangerous this assignment was. The briefing had been characteristically blunt. The Jumo 004 engines were revolutionary. They were also unstable, prone to catastrophic failure, and possessed an operational lifespan measured in hours rather than hundreds of hours. The aircraft could outrun any Allied fighter in existence. It could also kill you before you ever saw an enemy. Spate's job was simple in concept, suicidal in execution: prove the aircraft could be flown operationally, develop tactics, train pilots, and somehow survive long enough to make the Me-262 into a weapon that could change the course of the war. He climbed into the cockpit. No rumble of a piston engine, no familiar vibration, just an eerie whistle as the turbines spooled up, a sound like wind screaming through a tunnel. Spate released the brakes. The acceleration was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Not the gradual build of a propeller-driven fighter, but instant violent thrust that pressed him back into his seat. The runway blurred. The Messerschmitt leaped into the air at 175 kilometers per hour, and then it kept accelerating. 300, 400, 500. The familiar landmarks of the Bavarian countryside began to compress into a green and brown smear. At 870 kilometers per hour, Später understood something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. This aircraft didn't just fly faster than anything the Allies had, it flew faster than human reflexes had evolved to handle. At these speeds, decisions that normally took 2 seconds to execute now had to happen in half a second. The margin for error hadn't just shrunk, it had essentially vanished. One moment of distraction, one slight miscalculation, and you would be dead before your brain finished processing what went wrong. But speed was only half the revelation. The other half came when Spate tried to land. Jet engines, he quickly discovered, didn't respond like piston engines. Push the throttle forward on a Messerschmitt 109, and power came almost instantly. Push the throttle on a jet, and there was a delay. A terrifying gap of several seconds while the turbines spooled up, during which you were committed to whatever decision you had made. Pull the throttle back, and the engines took even longer to wind down. It was like flying an aircraft with a deliberate pause built into every control input, a machine that responded to your commands only after making you wait and wonder whether it would respond at all. The landing approach felt less like flying and more like negotiating with physics. Too slow, and the aircraft would drop out of the sky like a brick, the jet engines unable to provide enough thrust at low speeds to keep the heavy machine aloft. Too fast, and you would overshoot the runway, and with engines that took forever to spool down, there would be nothing you could do except ride it out and hope. Spate came in at 220 kilometers per hour, nearly twice the landing speed of a conventional fighter, the runway approaching at a rate that made his hands sweat inside his gloves. The wheels touched, the aircraft bounced, settled, rolled. He was alive. He climbed out of the cockpit, his legs shaking slightly, and realized he was smiling. Not from joy, from the strange exhilaration that comes from surviving something you weren't entirely sure you would survive. An engineer approached, asked how it flew. Spate's response was honest, like riding a rocket with barely enough control to keep it from killing you. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the desperation that permeated Germany in 1944. This wasn't the confident Reich of 1940, drunk on easy victories and convinced of inevitable triumph. This was a nation watching its cities burn, its armies retreating, its airspace violated daily by bomber formations so large they darkened the sky. The Luftwaffe was being systematically destroyed, not just defeated but erased, losing pilots faster than training schools could replace them, losing aircraft faster than factories could build them. Germany was losing the war in the air, and everyone with eyes and a brain knew it. The Me-262 represented something more than a technological achievement. It represented hope, irrational, desperate hope that one revolutionary weapon could somehow reverse irreversible momentum. Hitler saw it and immediately demanded it be converted into a bomber, a decision that would delay its deployment as a fighter by crucial months. Goering saw it and dreamed of reclaiming the air superiority the Luftwaffe had lost. The generals saw it and calculated that if they could just get enough of them into the air, they might be able to stem the tide of Allied bombers that were reducing German industry to rubble. But between the dream and the reality stood a problem that couldn't be solved by willpower or ideology. The engines kept exploding. The Jumo 004 was a marvel of engineering and a nightmare of metallurgy. Germany in 1944 lacked access to the high-temperature alloys needed for reliable jet engines. Chromium, nickel, molybdenum, the metals that could withstand the inferno inside a jet turbine, were either unavailable or reserved for other weapons. German engineers did what desperate engineers always do. They improvised. They used mild steel. They used ceramics. They used materials they knew wouldn't last, because something that worked for 10 hours was better than nothing. The result was an engine with an operational lifespan of approximately 25 hours before it required complete overhaul. Some lasted 10 hours, some exploded after 3. Pilots never knew which category their engines fell into. Every flight was a gamble. The engines were also spectacularly fragile. Push the throttle too quickly, and you could surge the compressor, causing a catastrophic flame out. Pull it back too fast, and the same thing could happen. The engine required constant, gentle, careful management, the kind of delicate touch that was easy to maintain during a training flight and nearly impossible to remember when you were being chased by a Mustang at 800 kilometers per hour. And then there was the fuel. The Jumo 04 ran on J2, a diesel-based jet fuel that was less volatile than gasoline, but also less available. As the war progressed and Allied bombing crippled German refineries, J2 became increasingly scarce. Pilots sometimes found themselves grounded, not because their aircraft was damaged, not because they lacked the will to fight, but because there was simply no fuel. The most advanced fighter in the world, sitting uselessly on the runway, a monument to the gap between technological capability and industrial reality. Spaht knew all of this. Every pilot training on that Me-262 knew all of this. They flew anyway, not because they were stupid or brainwashed, but because of something more complicated. Some flew out of duty, the ingrained discipline of military service. Some flew out of patriotism, a genuine belief they were defending their homeland. Some flew out of fear, knowing that refusing could mean a firing squad. And some flew because they were 23 years old, and the Me-262 was the most incredible machine they had ever touched. And the part of the brain that calculates risk doesn't fully develop until age 25. By late 1944, the Me-262 was finally entering operational service with Jagdverband 44, an elite unit composed of some of Germany's most experienced pilots. These were men with hundreds of combat missions, men who had survived years of aerial warfare, men who understood aircraft and tactics as well as anyone alive. They took one look at the Me-262's performance characteristics and realized they were being asked to invent an entirely new form of aerial combat. Every tactic the Luftwaffe had developed over 5 years of war was suddenly obsolete. Dogfighting, the twisting, turning, close-range combat that had defined air warfare since 1914, was impossible in the Me-262. The aircraft was too fast, too heavy, too unresponsive at low speeds. Try to dogfight in a Me-262, and you would either stall and fall out of the sky or overshoot your target, and present your vulnerable engines to enemy fire. The old rules didn't apply. New rules had to be written in real time by pilots who were also trying not to die. The solution they developed was as elegant as it was terrifying. High-speed slashing attacks. Dive from above, accelerate to maximum speed, make one firing pass, and then use your speed to climb away before the enemy could react. No maneuvering, no second chances. You had perhaps 2 seconds to line up your shot, fire your 4 30mm cannons and escape. Miss and you had to climb, circle and try again, burning fuel and engine hours with every attempt. It worked. When it worked, it was devastatingly effective. Me-262s began shooting down American bombers and their fighter escorts with the efficiency that alarmed Allied commanders. A single Me-262 could dive through a bomber formation, destroy 2 or 3 aircraft in a matter of seconds, and vanish before the gunners could track it. The speed advantage was so overwhelming that Allied fighters simply couldn't catch them. A Mustang pilot could see an Me-262, could chase it, could fire at it, and would watch helplessly as the German jet pulled away as if the Mustang was standing still. But effectiveness and survival were not the same thing. The Me-262 pilots were discovering that their greatest enemy wasn't Allied fighters, it was their own aircraft. Lieutenant Franz Schal, an ace with over 100 victories, died when his Me-262's landing gear collapsed on takeoff. Major Walter Nowotny, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with 258 victories, died when one of his engines failed during combat, leaving him vulnerable to pursuing Mustangs. Pilots survived the mission only to die on landing, when engines exploded from the stress of sustained high-speed flight. The psychological weight of this was crushing. Combat pilots are trained to accept that they might die fighting the enemy. That's the trade. You accept the risk because there's a chance, a possibility that skill and luck and training might save you. But the Me-262 added a new variable. You might die because your own aircraft decided to kill you, and there was nothing your skill could do about it. You couldn't outfly an engine explosion. You couldn't outmaneuver a compressor failure. Every single flight required you to trust a machine you knew was untrustworthy, to bet your life on engines you knew were designed to fail. This is where we need to slow down and understand something about human psychology that the Me-262 exposed in the cruelest possible way. Human beings are remarkably good at accepting certain kinds of danger. Soldiers charge into machine gun fire. Pilots fly into flak-filled skies. We can accept risks when we feel we have some control, some agency, some ability to influence the outcome through our actions. But we are psychologically devastated by danger we cannot control. Uncontrollable danger doesn't just scare us, it breaks us. Me-262 pilots lived with uncontrollable danger every moment they were in the cockpit. They could be the most skilled pilot in the Luftwaffe, could execute every procedure perfectly, could fly with flawless precision and still die because a turbine blade fractured or a fuel line cracked or a compressor surge ignited. The aircraft demanded perfection and offered no guarantees. This created a specific kind of stress that the Luftwaffe Medical Corps had no framework for understanding. These weren't pilots breaking down from combat fatigue. These were pilots developing symptoms of chronic stress from their own aircraft. Some pilots developed superstitions. They would only fly certain aircraft, convinced that some Me-262s were lucky and others were cursed. They weren't wrong. Some airframes did seem more reliable, though whether this was real or confirmation bias was impossible to determine. Some pilots refused to push their engines past 90% throttle, accepting reduced performance in exchange for what they hoped was increased reliability. Some flew every mission as if it might be their last, not because of the enemy, but because statistically it very well might be. And yet they continued to fly. This is the part of the story that's hardest to understand from the comfort of the present. Why didn't they refuse? Why didn't they ground themselves, declare the aircraft too dangerous, demand safer equipment? The answer is complicated and uncomfortable. Some didn't refuse because military discipline doesn't allow refusal. Some didn't refuse because they believed in the cause they were fighting for, however misguided that cause was. Some didn't refuse because they had seen what happened to people who refused orders in Nazi Germany. And some didn't refuse because despite everything, Despite the danger and the fear and the knowledge that the aircraft might kill them, the Me-262 was the only weapon they had that could actually hurt the endless formations of Allied bombers that were destroying their country. By early 1945, the situation had moved beyond desperate into surreal. Germany was producing Me-262s faster than it could train pilots to fly them. Aircraft sat at airfields, perfectly functional, waiting for pilots who didn't exist because the training program couldn't keep pace with combat losses. The few operational units were flying multiple missions per day, pushing engines far beyond their already inadequate lifespan because there were no replacement engines and no time to overhaul the ones they had. Pilots were taking off in aircraft they knew might explode, to fight a war they knew was lost, because the alternative was to do nothing while their cities burned. And here's the terrible irony that the Me-262 represents. It was, objectively, the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. It was faster than anything the Allies had. Its armament could destroy a bomber with a single burst. Its speed made it nearly invulnerable to interception. In a straight comparison of capability, the Me-262 was superior to every Allied fighter in service, and yet it changed nothing. Germany produced approximately 1,400 Me-262s. Only about 200 ever saw combat. Most were destroyed on the ground by Allied bombing, or sat unusable for lack of fuel, or were abandoned when their engines failed. The Me-262 was a revolutionary aircraft deployed by a military and industrial system that was collapsing faster than the revolution could be implemented. The pilots who flew it understood this disconnect in a way that was almost philosophical. They were fighting with weapons from the future in a war that was already over. Lieutenant Gerhard Barkhorn, flying his Me-262 through a formation of American bombers, shooting down 2 B-17s in a single pass, knew even as he was doing it that it didn't matter. There would be 50 more bombers tomorrow, and 100 more the day after that, and eventually there would be no more fuel, no more pilots, no more Germany. The Me-262 wasn't changing the outcome. It was just changing how long the ending took. March 1945. A Me-262 pilot whose name was never recorded in the after-action reports took off from a damaged airfield near Munich. His mission? Intercept American bombers attacking what remained of German industry. He climbed through 6,000 meters, his engines screaming, the airframe vibrating in a way that indicated something was already wrong. He spotted the bombers, a formation of 30 B-17s flying in their standard defensive box. He dove, accelerated, lined up his shot. The 30mm cannons thundered. A B-17 exploded, then a second. He pulled up, began his climbing escape, and felt the left engine surge, sputter, and die. The Me-262 could fly on one engine, but not well, not fast enough to escape. He saw the Mustangs coming, 4 of them, diving on him like hawks on a wounded dove. He pushed his remaining engine to maximum throttle, willing it to hold together just a little longer. The engine responded, and then it didn't. A sound like a grenade detonating inside metal, a shudder that ran through the entire airframe. Smoke poured from the nacelle. The Me-262, this machine from the future, this aircraft that represented the pinnacle of German engineering and desperation, was now a glider with the aerodynamic properties of a brick. The pilot ejected, his parachute opened, and he floated down toward enemy territory, watching his aircraft spiral into the Bavarian countryside and explode. He survived the war. Many didn't. The casualty rate for Me-262 pilots was staggering, though the exact numbers are debated, because records from the final months of the war are incomplete and chaotic. What is known is that a disproportionate number of Germany's most experienced pilots died flying the Me-262, not because they were bad pilots, but because the aircraft killed experienced and inexperienced pilots with equal enthusiasm. After the war, Allied intelligence teams swarmed over captured Me-262s, studying them, testing them, trying to understand how Germany had achieved such a dramatic technological leap. American and British engineers examined the Jumo 04 engines and came to a unanimous conclusion: brilliant design, terrible execution. The fundamental engineering was sound. The materials were inadequate. The Me-262 was a glimpse of the future, built with the leftovers of a collapsing present. Some of the German engineers who designed the Me-262 were recruited by the Americans and Soviets, their expertise judged more valuable than their politics. They went on to influence the development of American and Soviet jets in the post-war era. The knowledge gained from the Me-262 directly contributed to aircraft like the F-86 Sabre and the MiG-15. The revolutionary aircraft that had been too late to save Germany became the foundation for the jets that would dominate the skies in Korea just 5 years later. But the pilots who flew it, who survived it, carried a different kind of knowledge. They understood something that couldn't be captured in technical documents or engineering specifications. They understood the psychological cost of being asked to fly a machine that was as likely to kill you as the enemy. They understood what it meant to take off every morning, knowing that the greatest threat to your survival was not the Allied fighters or the flak or the bombers, but the aircraft you were strapped into. They understood the terrible mathematics that calculated their lives as acceptable losses in pursuit of a weapon that might, possibly, if everything went right, delay the inevitable by a few weeks. Wolfgang Sparta survived the war. He wrote about his experiences flying the Me-262, and his writing carries a tone that's hard to define. Not quite pride, not quite regret, something closer to bewilderment. He had flown the most advanced aircraft in the world. He had survived when so many hadn't. He had witnessed the intersection of technological breakthrough and systemic collapse, had seen firsthand what happens when innovation outpaces the infrastructure needed to support it. In his later years, when asked about the Me-262, he would say it was the most dangerous aircraft he ever flew, and that included combat missions over Stalingrad. The Me-262 forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about technological progress and human cost. We tend to think of innovation as inherently good, as movement towards something better. But innovation deployed in desperation can become a form of violence against the people forced to use it. The Me-262 didn't just push the boundaries of aviation. It pushed pilots beyond the limits of reasonable risk, asked them to accept odds that would be considered criminally negligent in any other context, and justified this by framing their deaths as necessary sacrifices. And here's what makes it even more complicated. Some of the pilots accepted this trade willingly, not because they were brainwashed or suicidal, but because they believed, genuinely believed, that their sacrifice might protect their families, their cities, their country. From the bombs that fell every night, they were wrong. The Me-262 changed nothing strategically, but they didn't know that. They couldn't know that. They only knew that they had a weapon, however flawed, and a duty, however misguided, and a choice to make every morning: climb into the cockpit or don't. This is what the Me-262 reveals about the gap between technological capability and human wisdom. We can build machines that exceed human limits. We can engineer aircraft that fly faster than human reflexes can manage. We can create weapons that demand more courage than it's reasonable to ask. But the existence of capability doesn't justify its use. The ability to build something doesn't mean we should, and it certainly doesn't mean we should ask people to die testing whether it works. The Me-262 sits in museums now, sleek and deadly and inert. Visitors photograph it, admire its revolutionary design, read plaques about its technical specifications. What the plaques often don't capture is the human cost embedded in that airframe. Every Me-262 that saw combat represented a pilot who had to manage not just the enemy, but his own aircraft's determination to kill him. Every one represented a calculation that human lives were acceptable currency to purchase a few more weeks of a war that was already lost. And perhaps that's the deepest lesson the Me-262 teaches. Not about jet engines or swept-wing aerodynamics or the tactical advantages of speed, but about what happens when systems, whether military or political or technological, treat human beings as expendable components in service of goals those humans have no power to question. The Me-262 pilots couldn't change German strategy. They couldn't redesign the engines. They couldn't end the war. They could only climb into the cockpit and hope that today wouldn't be the day their aircraft decided to explode. Some days it wasn't. Some days it was. And in the end, the most revolutionary fighter aircraft of World War II is remembered not just for what it achieved, but for what it cost. The price wasn't paid in Reichsmarks or aluminum or steel. It was paid in the lives of pilots who flew a machine that represented the future while fighting for a regime that represented the worst of humanity's past. They deserved better than they got. They deserved aircraft that wouldn't kill them. They deserved commanders who valued their lives more than their utility. They deserved a cause worth dying for. They got the Me-262 instead, a machine so advanced it could kill you before the enemy got the chance, and so flawed it would fail you when you needed it most. The last Me-262 combat mission was flown on May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. The pilot took off, flew for 30 minutes and landed safely. His engines didn't explode. He didn't get shot down. He simply parked the aircraft, climbed out, and walked away, leaving the most advanced fighter in the world sitting on a runway that would soon be occupied by Allied forces. The war was over. The Me-262 had changed nothing except the lives of the men who flew it and the families of those who didn't come back. In the mathematics of war, the Me-262 was a failure. It came too late, in too few numbers, with too many problems. But in the psychology of war, it represents something we need to remember. It shows us what happens when innovation is driven by desperation rather than wisdom. It shows us the human cost of treating soldiers as test subjects for unproven technology. It shows us that just because we can build something doesn't mean the people who have to use it will survive the experience. And it shows us that sometimes the most dangerous thing on the battlefield isn't the enemy. Sometimes it's your own side's refusal to admit that some prices are too high to pay.